And now, as they say, it's time for something completely different. In 1958, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik and sent a crisis through our political leadership around the state of American science education. A group of professors at MIT got together and decided that they wanted to reshape the way science was being taught in the United States, and separated a little bit from MIT, created a company that now has become the Education Development Center, hired some teachers to work with them, brought in some media experts, and created a brand new type of curriculum, PSSC Physics, which actually had kids doing experiments and working with lab equipment and watching videos of Nobel laureate physicists to really get a sense of what physics was about. That curriculum went on to be used in, I think, something like 80% of US high schools in a very short period of time. EDC went on and created numerous other curriculums in science, things like the Elementary Science Study, ESS, that had kids going out and sampling pond water and looking through microscopes and growing mealybugs at home and in school and all kinds of things. Currently, EDC has grown to a fairly large, but still a not-for-profit company that does things like run the Regional Education Lab for the Northeastern Islands and partners on the Regional Education Labs in the Midwest and Appalachia, where we actually form alliances with school district leaders, state education authorities, to actually create research agendas around doing hard, quality research on things that matter, like English language learners, virtual schooling, effective teaching, career success, college preparation, and other areas where together, not just as abstract researchers, but researchers working at the behest of districts and states. Interesting program. But during the last 20 years, EDC has also begun working internationally. And currently, about half our work overall is in developing countries around the world to help primarily with basic education, basic literacy and math in some of the hardest to work in places in the world. In many of these countries, it's not just work on improving the quality of teaching and learning. It's actually making schooling available for the first time to many children who just don't have a local school available to them. Just a little background on where things are in the developing country context. First of all, demographically, we have a very young worldwide population where in Africa and South Asia, over 43%, in some places much higher than that, are under the age of 15. About 15 years ago, countries banded together and signed something called the Education for All agenda, which pledged that by 2015, all children in the world would have access to basic education, primary education, compulsory schooling in most cases. And there's been a lot of work to achieve that goal. I don't think we're going to make it, frankly, but the progress has been pretty significant. Just in the last 10 years, there's been a six-fold increase in primary enrollment and even more increases at the secondary level. The problem, however, is that in many countries, it's hard to keep kids in school. The economic pressure on families to have their kids join the family work in the fields, the pressures because of culture or religion on girl children attending school, and the very realistic pressure that parents who might want to send their kids to school, but that idea of having to walk 3 or 4 kilometers to school. In fact, we've done studies that show for each kilometer away from a school, the likelihood of a parent sending, especially their girl children, to that school diminishes by 20%. The issues are fairly enormous in developing countries. First of all, where there are schools, there's no materials. We encounter time and time again that textbooks have been printed, but if they get to the school, they sometimes don't arrive till halfway through the school year. And there are legendary stories of contracts with somebody's uncle who's the textbook publisher, having warehouses full of textbooks that never get to the schools or get to the marketplace where they're sold. Most countries had, as recently as 5 years ago, school fees, where only parents who could afford to pay a fee would have their children attending classes. In many countries, that's changed, but ironically, there aren't enough teachers to staff all these schools. So regularly, you've seen school class size increase. And this isn't an academic argument about whether 20 or 25 kids are better. Imagine teaching a first grade reading class with 85 kids in it, or 90 kids. That's fairly typical in parts of Africa or the Middle East. And along with that has become a real lowering of the quality just because of the methods that you have to use to teach that many children. So for us, these problems require a focus on how to make innovations that really can go to scale and can be sustainable. Anybody with enough money could come in with all kinds of nifty things like computers and libraries and other things that are needed, but how do you keep that so that it can be sustainable by their countries after whatever donor government gets through its philanthropy? So we've looked for technologies that are already there, that are already in the communities, that have large-scale access. For many years, that was radio. It was the one technology that you could find even in poor rural villages. Most state governments had put in some form of radio for communication. And so we experimented, and over the last 20 years have developed pedagogical techniques called interactive audio instruction. The interaction isn't around the technology. This is straight broadcast radio or more recently on things like MP3 players. It's in the pedagogy where you stop the play, you do things with the students interactively, you have a more child-centered approach. And in fact, the interesting part of this pedagogy is that it's a dual approach. Somewhat similar maybe to parts of PD 360, where the radio provides direct instruction to the children, but at the same time it's talking to the teacher and giving them tips on how to implement the curriculum, what to look for in the children, what to do. And so we can take a fairly poorly educated teacher who may only have an 8th grade education themselves and actually help them to become a better teacher. The other thing that's happening very rapidly is the world isn't so isolated anymore. Bandwidth is rapidly spreading. This little table shows that just in the last 12 years, there's been a 10-fold increase in the kind of bandwidth, meaning internet access, that's available at least around the edges of the African continent. And now that's rapidly moving inside. The interesting thing is, it's not driving internet as we know it in the United States. It's all going into mobile bandwidth on cell phones. So that as recently as 2009, The Economist declared that the most common way of accessing the internet in the world was through a mobile phone, not a computer or a tablet. And if any of you have traveled internationally, you notice how ubiquitous the cell phones are, even more so than perhaps the United States. I've gone into some of these large spreading slums around African cities like Kibera around Nairobi, where there are no government services, no water, no sanitation, no economy, no schools certainly, no hospitals or medical care. And yet most youth have figured out how to get a cell phone and are adept at using it. So I want to focus in on a couple examples, and then I'm going to go back and try to draw some lessons for all of us out of these examples. One place that we actually have several projects going on right now is Mali. As you know, Mali's been in the news. They've had a coup. We've had to evacuate our staff and then send them back in, and then evacuate them again and send them back in. Not the easiest way to do professional development, but a very necessary place. 20% of the children in Mali aren't in school. There are real difficulties in learning the national language, which is French, which is not spoken by most of the people, and almost no understanding of how to teach reading. People teach the alphabet, but no ability to connect it. No formative or diagnostic testing is in place. So we have a project where we're reaching 12,000 teachers and 600,000 students through a couple different interesting techniques. One is, first of all, there's no culture of literacy in the homes. You can go into homes and there's no reading material. I mean, there aren't manuals for a washing machine or for a toaster. There are literally nothing there that has print on it. There aren't cereal boxes or any of the kinds of things that, with a little creativity, you could develop a reading program around that. So part of our program was to create local content and put it on e-readers. And so the class, just with a few e-readers, you could actually give fairly large amounts of reading material. The difficulty in this was not getting the e-readers or producing the content. It was actually helping teachers understand the concept of a learning center. If all you've experienced is lecture method teaching, that was the difficulty in changing the practice. We're also using smartphones. One of the difficulties is how to get out new types of lessons or share lessons. And let me make a statement, which I hope doesn't offend some people in the room. The Cascade model of professional development just doesn't work internationally. I'm not even sure it works here, but this idea of training the trainers who then go back and train others and so on is probably the most typical way of providing professional development in most countries in the world. The fidelity of that drops off, at least in all the countries we've worked with, almost immediately. And so we have to figure out ways to directly interact with teachers, and they're not that different from the things you're experiencing in the programs like PD 360. We now are using not smartphones, just phones that have features in them where we can put a smart chip in or something like that that will allow people to store lots of content. In most countries, they still can't afford to pay the bandwidth charges to download lesson plans or videos or things like that. But you can store several months' worth of that kind of professional development on the phone when a teacher comes to a teacher resource center or when you go out to visit the school. And then teachers can have 2 months, 3 months of experiences where they then use very inexpensive or no-cost text messaging to go back and forth. So we have lots of work going on in that area. We're also doing it directly with older youth who never had schooling and now are faced with the challenges of trying to make a living in countries where there just aren't a lot of economic opportunities. So we're training them not only in basic literacy and numeracy, but also in job skills, in life skills, how to present yourself, how to put together a resume. And we've even used in some countries resume banks that connect potential employers with youth who have written resumes and then can respond to employer inquiries through SMS systems, and it's been quite successful. So one big solution in these countries is interactive audio instruction, which has proven to be quite successful. It looks like this. There's usually some kind of MP3 player with solar chargers and a battery, because most of these places we work in don't have electricity yet. That's a typical classroom or school in many of the countries we work in. That's a typical setup: a battery, a solar panel, and an inexpensive iPod or other type of MP3 player, and speakers, because remember, you've got 80 to 90 kids surrounding that in the classroom. It's worked in many different countries, and it's worked for children that are in classrooms already. The gains are usually about 20% over children in the same types of classrooms that don't have this interactive audio instruction. And again, it's partly because the teachers are improving at the same time as the students. In classes where there are no schools and an adult volunteer from the community serves as the teacher, the gains are almost as good as in regular schools. So it's a viable alternative until there are schools available for the children. And the reach of interactive instruction is amazing. In India, we just completed a 7-year project where we ended up reaching 42 million children whose state governments had decided that English was going to be the language of instruction starting in first or in some cases second grade. And yet most of the teachers, especially in the rural areas, didn't speak English. Can you imagine the challenge of having to teach reading or math in a language you don't even speak yourself? The cost of this works out to be about $2 to $3 per year per learner. So it's affordable in many countries that don't yet have the economies to promote full-time schooling in more traditional ways. We've also found that assessments for teachers of the kind that lead to diagnostic information are extremely important. So we created a low-cost reading assessment based on something called the Early Grades Reading Assessment that grows right out of the work around reading recovery and dibbles and that sort of work. Normally that would be very difficult to introduce in developing country classrooms, but using very low-cost netbooks and tablets and work with provincial and district leaders, we're able to actually give teachers in almost real time diagnostic assessments that then help them translate that information into changed classroom practices around reading instruction. Some recent work in Yemen. Just before things got a little dicey there, we had a 4-year project dealing with high school teachers in science, specifically chemistry, physics, and biology, and mathematics at the 10th grade level. Yemen scored right down at the bottom on the PISA test and had real concern about the way these sciences and math were being taught. We worked with teachers. One of the techniques we do in all of these countries is determine the hard spots in the curriculum. What are the 10 or 12 things that are most difficult for your students to understand or grasp? What concepts do you have difficulty translate? And that's what we focus in on first. In this case, it was those concepts in biology, physics, chemistry, and math that 10th grade teachers were having struggles with their students. And we worked to take freely available applets that are out there in Flash and other computer languages and help the ministry learn to customize that not only to their local language, but to their culture and to their scope and sequence within their curriculum. And just introducing 10 digital objects for each semester and getting the teachers and the principals to agree to offer those in the few high schools that actually have electricity in Yemen, we've got amazing gains in their end-of-course testing, where students achieve pretty dramatic results. And when I've presented this information in more detail at AERA, people actually didn't believe the results. It was almost too good to be true. But it's pretty common that when you actually are able to help teachers do their job, they get excited, they transform, and the results really are staggering. I want to go back to one thing before I wind up. The only reason why I included this shot is I think most people in this room probably do professional development at some point during the year or in their career. Can you imagine doing a professional development experience? In this case, I was there for 2 weeks doing a workshop with teachers. And because they're all clothed in garments that don't have any way of revealing body shape, and the only thing that you can see are eyes, and in this case, everyone has brown eyes. Teachers would get really excited, as they do in workshops, and would come up to you and ask questions. And the next day, I'd go back to give them the answer that I looked up or found out for them. And I had no clue how to distinguish between these teachers. They all looked the same. It's very embarrassing and difficult as a workshop leader. All right, so What are the key implications from all of this? First of all, put education problems first. The technology is always going to be in a context. It is not the solution. It's a way to deliver the solution. That sounds basic. You've probably heard it in 100 other workshops and talks. But it's really key, and especially in a developmental context, people always think of technology as the saving thing that's going to come in and transform it. It doesn't. It's just the vehicle to accomplish something else. Secondly, make sure that it actually adds value, that somehow it can amplify. And there are 3 areas. First, building a community of practice. It's very hard to have conversations with just the teachers in your school, especially if you're the only teacher in that school. So you have to use technology. We found that even in the poorest countries, teachers will use text messaging or whatever to improve the quality of their instruction. They want to be part of a community of practice. A whole lot that we could go into. I could do a whole hour long on performance management, but that's as important in a country like Yemen or Mali as it is here. Sustainability. Start with human infrastructure and then think about the infrastructure. We always do it the other way. We start with the engineering because it's easier. Use the technology that's there. I know of very few cases where technology specifically designed for education ever survives very long. Cell phones are probably the most powerful education tool because they're already in everybody's hands. You don't have to drive it in there. Finally, localization. It doesn't matter that we have great curriculum here in the United States. It doesn't translate. Yes, it literally translates, but it doesn't translate. There has to be localization. Final point, dual audiences. Build instructional materials that talk to the teacher at the same time they're talking to the student or working with the student. Finally, the important thing, and the last point I'll make, is information and communications technology. The C is really important. We focus on delivering information. But time and again, we've proven, both in the consumer marketplace and in the education marketplace, communication is what's important. And now that we have fidelity in instruments like video, we can move beyond trying to represent human behavior solely in numerical terms. That's great, it's useful, but it doesn't go far enough. We've now got powerful tools like video that can really share human behavior in ways that we've never been able to before. And again, I think at this conference, you're going to actually see ways of doing that increasingly through things like the live book and so on. And finally, people are using symbolic representations, words, ideas, video, graphics. They innately want to do it. Parents will use income that they don't have to provide their children with education. It is one of the driving forces of humanity. And despite all our budget pressures that we'll be facing when we go back to our school districts and so on, that's the constant that we experience over the next few years. Good luck to you and enjoy the conference.